Now it's time for Culture Talk. This is where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with Ken Samples, philosopher and theologian.
Hi, Sandra.
Yeah, and you're a big fan of Pascal.
He would be a great guest on Culture Talk.
Right, yeah, well, booking is the problem. So you've written a book called Classic Christian Thinkers.
Yeah.
And you have 9 thinkers in there who you really kind of unpack and help Christians understand their relevancy today. So we're going to look at one in particular, and that's Blaise Pascal. So who was he?
Yeah, a very important thinker. Born in 1623, dies in 1662. So he dies at 39 years old, has something like stomach cancer. But what a life in 39 years. For example, as a youth, he develops probability theory. He develops ideas in mathematics. He even develops a calculating machine that many scientists today say is the first step toward a computer.
Oh, wow.
Physicists, and in his early 30s, he has a dramatic conversion to Christianity. Kind of grows up nominally Catholic, but he's crossing the River Seine there in France and has some kind of visionary experience where he sees Jesus or something like it. So then he pours all of his intellectual ability into presenting Christianity, defending Christianity, and his classic book is called Pensées, which in French is thoughts or reflections.
Yeah. So what would you say are some of his lasting contributions, not only to the faith, but also to the world? And you mentioned his computing.
Yeah.
What was it?
There's a computer language named, there's only one Christian in the world that has a computer language named after him. It's Blaise Pascal, which shows you his technological, he was an inventor. One thing that I think is very interesting is Pascal talked a lot about, even though he was a real intellectual, he talked about the heart. He talked about, we encounter God in the heart. And what he meant was, of course, not the pump, not, the physical heart, but the inner you, deep inside you. That's where you encounter, you form your most basic beliefs. He talked about the heart. And of course, he's probably best known for the wager argument. But I love when he talks about the heart and the human condition and our need for God.
Well, I read an article recently talking, and it wasn't a Christian article, but it was talking about the lasting impact of Pascal's art of persuasion. So help us understand what that is.
Yeah, well, Pascal thought that, people could be persuaded by reason and rationality, but he ultimately thought to really come to accept something and to be fully persuaded by it, it had to go deeper than just the mind. It had to sink into your soul, which is, again, his metaphor for heart. And so for him, persuasion is not merely a matter of making arguments. It has to do with things like credibility. We've talked in the past about ethos and pathos. Pascal tracks with that idea that ultimately people are persuaded by things that hit them at the very soul of their being.
So can you unpack the art of persuasion a bit more, maybe diving into some of those particular tactics to help persuade others?
Yeah, I think Pascal thought, for example, that instead of telling people what to believe or how to think, he thought that it was very powerful to get them to start thinking for themselves, to get them to ask questions. And a lot of times when we want to share the gospel or we want to defend the faith, we marshal out all these kind of arguments. But it might be better in terms of persuasion if we get that person to think about their own life, to think about their sinful condition, to think about their need for God, their yearnings, their longings. So that's part of that kind of developing, getting people to think for themselves, getting people to reflect a little bit more.
Yeah. So when we think about the art of persuasion and how we engage today with non-Christians and wanting to share the faith with them, what can we glean from what Pascal taught to help us engage non-Christians?
I think one thing that we can utilize from Pascal is that there's more going on in a person than we realize. Philosophers sometimes talk about some people are persuaded by reason. Sometimes it's clouded by irrational thinking.
Right.
But sometimes there is what we call, and I think Pascal would relate to this significantly, are non-rational factors. That is sometimes we're set in a particular way to believe particular things. I think sometimes people end up believing what they want to believe.
Right.
So Pascal would say, as a human being who's made in the image of God, a human being that is fallen, that we want to recognize that there may be other motives than what even that person is conscious of. And so getting them to think, getting them to reflect, maybe getting them to look at Scripture for themselves. Pascal thought, instead of steamrolling them, get them to reflect a little bit more.
Right. And that's a good reminder, so that we don't want to just give people data, but we allow them to kind of work through their own worldview and the implications of that, and maybe ask some questions.
And a lot of time, and I'm certainly in this case, a lot of times people think if I just give you the right argument, give you all the data you need, then it's a slam dunk. Pascal would say people are more complicated than that. There's more going on inside them. They have motives. They have all kinds of inner issues. And I think he's very helpful. I think Pascal would be a great evangelist today.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing, Ken. If you want to hear more on this topic, I highly recommend checking out Ken Sample's book, Classic Christian Thinkers. Just go to shop.reasons.org.